I believe in the strength of the things that I believe in.
And I refuse to accept your thesis, that's all.
Everything that could have been done wrong has been done wrong. Well, I don't agree with the premise, but that's my job. I don't accept that the United States has anything like withdrawn from public life. It's heavily engaged in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, in the front line at the Ukraine. It's bombing and coordinating bombing in many other parts of the world. If that's the United States as an isolationist power, I'd hate to see them if they got onto the front foot. Neither do I accept Phil's apparent thesis at the end there that we are somehow alien to Europe because we don't speak the same language.
So what do you think Putin is?
A very smart operator, one of the smartest in the world today, 10 times smarter than the American president or the British Prime Minister for that matter. I believe he acts in Russia's interests, and it was not in Russia's interest to carry out the Skripal affair. If the hidden point in your question is, do I support him? No, I don't. If I'd been a Russian, I wouldn't have voted for him. But I do support many of the foreign policy stances that he has taken, particularly in Syria, where he has been instrumental in defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism in the Middle East, which I think is a necessary but not sufficient condition for stability, peace, progress in that area.
George, do you think that Putin has felt emboldened by America's not quite withdrawal from public life, but Obama clearly didn't want to get involved in any more military conflicts? I mean, I get the sense that Putin thought, great, now no one's going to oppose me in Ukraine.
But the United States is wholly engaged in Ukraine on Russia's front line. Victoria Nuland, former ambassador, now at the State Department, told us of the billions of dollars that she spent subverting the power in the Ukraine. John McCain and all the other neocon hawks were never off the streets. And the coup that took place in the Maidan, 18 months ago, is the cause of the confrontation between us and Russia. I don't see that Putin has done anything wrong anywhere else. He frustrated Western policy in Syria. That's true, but that wasn't wrong. I don't see where this charge sheet against Putin is drawn up from. Now, Russia is a capitalist country with an Russia's a normal capitalist country.
Run by a kleptocracy.
It is run by a kleptocracy, but not quite as kleptocratic as the Yeltsin era, which was, of course, hailed by right-wing people in Britain as some kind of golden era. The reason Putin is popular in Russia is because he's taking some of the wealth back from the kleptocrats. Now,
to himself.
I don't think it's to himself. I don't see where you're a respected journalist. I don't know why you would make such an assertion on tape without the remotest piece of evidence to support it.
You're saying he's not corrupt?
I'm saying that he is not taking money for himself. Where's the evidence? Give me your evidence. He's giving Russia back some of its perceived national dignity that it lost under Yeltsin. Well, you can laugh if you like, but that's how Russians see it. Now, my point is...
That's why there are protests in the streets in the past few weeks.
Well, there are protests in every street, Bronwyn. There are protests in London. But that doesn't mean that the majority of Russians don't support Putin. My point is, I don't know why you needed to have a confrontation with Putin. He's not my man, he's your man. I'm a leftist, he's not. If I could choose the government of Russia, it wouldn't be Putin. He's a man that thinks like you. He believes in capitalism, free markets. national states. I don't know why you needed to fall out with them. That's my point. China's a different kettle of fish. It has a different ideology, but Russia doesn't.
And the elephant in the room, the morass of the Syrian war. Some of you know me from my stand against the Iraq war. I'm here to tell you that the involvement of Western countries in the Syrian war is the worst thing we have ever done, i.e. worse than Libya, worse than Iraq. Our belligerent foreign policy of arming, financing, propagandizing for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the alphabet soup of Islamist fanaticism in Syria is the worst thing that we have ever done. And notwithstanding that the war is almost over, we may very well be about to double down, to double our bets on the catastrophic conflict in Syria. So, can a belligerent foreign policy bring about peace and stability in the world? Not bloody likely.
I mean, we could all have laughed at your assertion that the Iraq war was legal. You're the last man standing saying that it was legal.
I didn't say it was legal.
You're the last man standing saying that it was legal.
Well, I'm not.
But
even if I were, I wouldn't be, as it happens.
That isn't the point.
Quite.
The United States massacred millions of people in the lifetime, millions of people in the lifetime of many of the people here in Vietnam, and caused the massacre of millions more in Cambodia. Yet you parade the United States as some kind of lawful, benign force. Well, that's not how it looks from...
It's not how it sounds either.
Well,
both of us were quite careful. Well, both
Did
of us.
the United States bomb Vietnam?
Be quiet, and I'll tell you.
Let Phil answer.
It's very assertive of you, Phil.
Both of us were very clear in our remarks to say at the beginning that we do not regard the United States of America as some sort of caricature example of perfect goodness. We both were very clear that no country is in that position, and that though there are on both sides, there are things which the United States have done of which anyone would be proud, and things of which you would not. Now, it is not good enough for you to then pretend that our view of the United States is some sort of cartoon in which everything is rosy and gorgeous. Nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks anything so fundamentally and obviously stupid.
Will you be quiet now?
Okay.
The Middle East is a total catastrophe. Everything that could have been done wrong has been done wrong. From the Sykes-Picot fake artificial division of the Arab countries, double dealing as usual, at the end of the First World War, to the buttressing of tyranny throughout the intervening period, through, in one case, supporting Islamist fanaticism in one country, but opposing it in another country, and supporting it again in a third country, opposing it in a fourth. Our policy is a total catastrophe, and Libya is a very good case in point. Gaddafi was probably the worst, the most crazed of all the Arab leaders. Phil's ex-boss thought he could do business with him, and did quite successfully.
Didn't you buttress tyranny by supporting Saddam Hussein?
No, I'll come to Saddam Hussein if you would like. If they hadn't,
yes, please.
Yes, please.
If they hadn't overthrown Saddam Hussein, there would be no ISIS and there would be no Al-Qaeda cascading around the world.
There was
That's the fact.
9/11 was
That's
before the Iraq War.
That's the fact. There would be no ISIS in Iraq. There would be no ISIS in Syria. Now ISIS control 1/3 of each country. But don't let him off the hook with Libya. His former boss,
me.
yes, your former boss was the best of friends with Gaddafi. I've never met Gaddafi or any member of his grisly family, unlike Mr. Blair. I'm not blaming Phil for that. He was only the hired hand. But my point is,
I wasn't even there as it happened.
Gaddafi was a disaster. Gaddafi was a disaster. It takes real genius to make Libya 10, 50, 100 times worse after Gaddafi than it was under Gaddafi.
From here, the exceptionalization of Donald Trump to which you've just been listening is absurd. Donald Trump's been the President of the United States for less than 2 years. Did the chaos in the world start less than 2 years ago? It's utterly ridiculous. The crooner, your idol, nice soup Barack, destroyed Libya and turned it into a slave market and a jihad market for at least 7 heavily armed different Islamist groups. It wasn't Trump that did that, it was Obama that did that. You have the gall to pray and aid George W. Bush as somehow better than Donald Trump. George W. Bush and your other hero, Tony Blair, killed 1 million people in Iraq and rising, spawned ISIS, cascaded it across the world. You say how happy, how smug you are about the rules-based society that we had before Donald Trump 23 months ago, 22 months ago. Where was the rules-based order in the invasion and occupation of Iraq? An utterly illegal act, the consequences of which we'll still be feeling in 100 years from now. Where was the rules-based in the destruction of Yugoslavia? No international law, no United Nations Security Council, unilateral use of Western power deployed by the people you're trying to persuade us were better than Donald Trump. Vietnam was leveled, bombed back to the Stone Age, drowned in chemical weapons by Richard Nixon and by Lyndon Johnson. They were a part of this rules-based complacency of which you speak. And in aid of your argument, you draw attention to the fact that populists are coming to power. The populists are coming to power precisely because of the failure of your international order, precisely because of the failure of your orthodoxy. It's because neoliberal politics totally failed in Italy that you have the government in Italy you have. Ditto in Hungary. Ditto the rise, although it's stopped now, you may have noticed that Mélenchon, with whom I agree in every particular, is now the most popular politician in France. Not Le Pen. She's gone off for psychiatric treatment. The rise of Trump, the rise of Corbyn, the rise of the right and the populists in Italy are all because of the failure of this order which you so smugly wish to return us to.
I don't think it was about foreign policy, George, to be honest. The reason these populists have been so successful is because of domestic discontent.
But you can't separate foreign policy.
Yes, you can.
No,
The average voter on the doorstep who's voting for Donald Trump is not talking about Syria. They're talking about jobs and manufacturing.
You're quite wrong, in fact.
Really?
The reason for the rise of the populists in Italy is why? Because the country has been flooded by millions of refugees from the wars begun by your heroes.
First of all,
that's the reason why.
Let Mark defend himself.
Can I have returned?
Yeah, okay, can I first of all...
You've spoken for twice as long as me already.
I think you're both getting a very fair crack. Right.
No, I might have spoken for longer, but I wasn't accusing you of worshipping heroes that you didn't worship. So maybe I can sort of try and take a step back from your very powerful rhetoric and say, first of all, the fact that we can talk about breaches of the rules-based order like what happened in Iraq is because...
You called it a mistake, now it's a breach. It's 1 million people dead, for God's sake.
Well, there
This
were
isn't a rally, this is a
500,000
debate.
people who
Okay.
died of sanctions beforehand, according to people who were criticising it before. Saddam Hussein killed many, many people. I was against the war in Iraq, and I'm still against the war in Iraq. Nothing has happened over the last 15 years to change my mind about that. But I think it's the very fact that there was an order that we can recognise that as a breach of the order. Now, what makes me slightly uncomfortable about your rhetorical flourish is that you put all of these different things, which are quite different, on the same level. You know, what happened in Vietnam, what happened in Iraq, being put on the same level as intervening to stop genocide in Kosovo, I find strange. They're not, you know, not every type of use of violence. I think using violence is always bad, but sometimes it's the least bad option. I think the Second World War was justified given what Hitler stood for. I think intervening in Kosovo was justified in order to stop a genocide where lots of innocent people were being...
That's what you said in Libya.
Well, I was not particularly involved in the Libyan war. I think with hindsight, what we can see is...
genocide in Libya, genocide in Kosovo,
Okay,
genocide
so there we
in
go.
Iraq,
So if
genocide in Syria.
Let
It's
Mark
always
finish.
genocide.
I'm not sure exactly. If everything's genocide, then it basically normalises the idea of genocide. For me...
Stop tossing it about then.
Well,
He had used
actually,
it- he
I
used
only
it for
used the
Kosovo,
word genocide once about my family that was actually wiped out in a
you
real...
said in Kosovo.
George,
There was no genocide in Kosovo.
there was ethnic cleansing and people being
That's
killed.
not genocide.
Well,
Yes. Thank you.
so...
You've got a microphone on, you don't need to shout.
Okay, so I do think that it's important not to toss words like genocide about.
Agreed.
It's also important not to put every single foreign policy decision that you disagreed with on the same level. There is the fact that there was a rules-based order means that we can see the breaches of that order, and that is what's being destroyed. And to see... I hated George Bush. He was my least favourite American president until Donald Trump was elected. I was absolutely disgusted by it. I wrote a whole book against Bush's foreign policy back in 2004. But at the same time, I do think that he was a fundamentally different figure from Donald Trump because he basically believed in the existence of a rule-based order and he was pushing to change it. Donald Trump wants to blow the whole thing up and to bring us to a stage of anarchy where the only thing that matters is the law of the jungle and where the strong decide what happens and the weak have to do what they tell them to do. And I don't want to live in that world. And I think if you can't see the difference between those two situations and you just normalize Trump and put him into some kind of continuum of betrayal which goes back, you know, centuries like you did beforehand, and everything is genocide and every military campaign is equally bad, then it's impossible to have a serious discussion about what we're trying to do in this world. I do think that there have been all sorts of mistakes made over the last few decades. I'm a social democrat, I'm not a neoliberal. I think that a lot of these populist parties are coming to power because of a failure of domestic politics. I think some of the leaders, like Jeremy Corbyn, are there because of failures of foreign policy. There would be no Corbyn if there hadn't been an Iraq war. That is clear to me. But I think it is important to try and hang on to what matters in these things. Because if not, you end up in a kind of nihilistic space, like where everything's equally bad and where the solution is where you just sort of have nothing constructive to say about anything because everyone is a war criminal, everyone is equally evil, everyone is kind of genocidal, and that completely undermines any critique that we have of what's happening at the moment, which I think is really worrying and scary and needs to be stopped.
We cannot hope to think that Europe can somehow be isolated from the world in that sense. People are moving. Capital is always moving. The world economy is deeply integrated now. So the notion that we can somehow withdraw and think that we can live our own little life behind Fortress Europe, again, not true. It's not true politically, it's not true diplomatically. It's not true in the sense that there are those people who want to do us harm from time to time. The world is so deeply enmeshed that the idea that we can be isolationists, I think, is a fallacy, something we've lost. And I never quite understand, George, where you end up with your view. You take all of your view, does it not lead to a kind of isolationist position, a sort of quietism? And I don't say that in order to be critical. I'm just a genuine inquiry isn't that the implication that the best response, if we take all of your views, is no response at all, is to let the world be as it is, where it is, and for us to remain within our boundaries quietly, getting on with our life. Now, I'm asking you whether that's your position, not attributing it to you. But if it is, that just doesn't seem realistic in the world we live in.
Well, of course, this session is not about me or about my views. You're entitled to...
No, I'm interested. I'm genuinely
interested. If you would like me to, I will, of course, say that actually nothing could be further from the truth. I'm not a pacifist, very far from it. I believe we have to defend ourselves. I think that the choice of a new generation of nuclear weapons and the submarines to platform them is a very bad choice in defense terms. I believe that we should defend our borders. We should defend our European borders. We should defend our British borders. We should organize ourselves so that our state and our states, collection of states, are a far more successful enterprise than they currently are. We have interests elsewhere. If anyone threatens our interests, we have a right to defend them. But that's not what we've been doing. When you go halfway around the world to invade another country and overthrow its government on a tower of lies, you're not defending your interests, you're imperiling your interests. As everyone, from the former head of MI5 to most sentient beings in the land, have already concluded that we actually damaged our own interests by invading and occupying Iraq. And it's not finished yet, not by a long chalk. So you asked me what I would do. I wouldn't do what you have already done, what you and the people that you supported have already done. And I said so at the time. The last conversation I ever had with Mr. Blair was this. The fall of Baghdad, 2 weeks before the war, the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, merely the end of the beginning. Number 2, there are no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But if you and Bush invade and occupy it, there will be hundreds of thousands of Al-Qaeda. And not just in Iraq, but in our own countries. And I was right. I mean, at least have the grace to acknowledge that. I was right, and he was wrong.
It's not that I'm passionately denouncing the rules-based international order. I'm passionately denouncing the fact that there is no rules-based international order. You just call lawlessness a rules-based international order with some mistakes, some breaches. But how many breaches does it take to invalidate your thesis in the first place? If you have what you call an international rules-based system in the world, which is not just breached, not just mistakes, but which kills millions of people and renders the whole world completely unstable. How many times does that need to happen before your thesis is invalidated? Now, for most people, it long ago ceased to be credible to call it a rules-based international order. And I refuse to accept your thesis, that's all.
I haven't got a thesis. I'm just asking you two what you think.
Well, your thesis is that there is an international rules-based order.
Oh, I see.
And my case is that it's abundantly clear that there has not been. And that therefore, attempts to exceptionalize Trump, which is the liberal mantra, are nonsense. He's only been in 23 months.
So if we hadn't
and the world was in total chaos before he came.
So if we hadn't had the United Nations and NATO set up after the Second World War, do you think the world would have been a better place?
No, because I believe in a United Nations with real authority. But as long as you have veto powers, it cannot possibly guarantee international order. I support the United Nations. It's Tony Blair and George W. Bush that walked out of the United Nations and caused the cataclysm, which is being, I think, underappreciated here, of the Iraq War. Not since the First World War did we take a decision that would so change the world as the decision to invade Iraq.
George, are you a narcissist, do you think, in your politics?
No, but I do think that that charisma and leadership qualities are very important. And
You
I
have
think
enormous
that
self-belief, don't you? You're the outsider.
I do have. It's not self-belief. It's belief in what I believe in. I'm well aware of my shortcomings and weaknesses and so on, but I believe in the strength of the things that I believe in, and I believe those things are more powerful than their adversaries as ideas. So I'm very confident. Now, as I alluded earlier, I went to a state school and left very early, never went to university, but now I speak every year at the Oxford Union and the Cambridge Union, and I speak at Winchester and Eton and all these fancy schools, very, very expensive schools. What's the main difference I see in the children from these schools and these universities and the children with whom I grew up? Is confidence. These children, their parents are getting what they're paying for. These children believe that they are the answer, that they have at least the right to address political figures of some standing and length and so on as equals. I've seen boys at the Oxford Union address the Foreign Secretary as if they were peers. And yet one is a 19-year-old Oxford student and the other is the Foreign Secretary. And I see nothing wrong with that. And I know why their parents are paying for that. Because if your child, or by projection, your politician, your leader, has no confidence, then why should you have confidence in them? I mean, it seems to me there's a necessary tension, of course, between such confidence and democracy, the danger of echo being the only voice that you hear. There's a tension between these two things, but both are necessary. The democratic restraint and sounding board, but the confidence and the charisma is also necessary. Otherwise you have mediocrity. And I think that Britain has been ruled by mediocrity for quite some time.
So just to take it back then to the leaders that we were talking about earlier, the narcissistic leader then, is that the leader that's more likely to lead you into danger, to lead you into war, because they're not hearing other voices, because of that self-belief, because of that sort of not thinking about other people, perhaps?
Undoubtedly, I think. Although George W. Bush was completely un-narcissistic and uncharismatic, imbecilic.
Well, although the thing that was
words.
always said about him was that he was the guy that everybody wanted to have around to their barbecue. That was his selling point.
I don't know how low your standards would be to want George W. Bush at your barbecue. So, I mean, it's neither one thing nor the other. I think that's what we're coming down to here in this discussion. You can be a narcissistic disaster like Blair, or you could be a narcissistic hero like Churchill. And if not for he, we'd be conducting this meeting in German. And so it's neither one thing nor the other for me. It's up to a point, but no further. It's with checks and balances. And in a democracy, you ought to have those. And you ought to have them on a daily basis by a proper inquiring, investigative, and independent, impartial media, which we have entirely lacked. Tony Blair led us all over a cliff because the Parliament became a rubber stamp and the media became an echo chamber. And therefore, the narcissism had disastrous consequences. If these checks and balances had been available, that narcissism would have been checked.
Your challenge, as I understand it, is to say that most politicians are liars.
Today.
Or hypocrites. Yes.
Today.
I'm not against your criticising Mr. Blair, particularly on Iraq. I'm not against criticising the Iraq war at all. I share the same view. But I think to suggest that all politicians or most politicians are liars and hypocrites is a terribly dangerous thing to say, and I don't believe for one moment it to be true.
Well, it would be dangerous if it were untrue.
No,
but the vast majority of people in the country already know that it's true.
Because
MPs were found by the Daily Telegraph's artful acquisition of a CD to be in their hundreds, more than 500s out of 650, looting the public purse in fraudulent expenses claims. It's a fact. You might think it's an uncomfortable truth to bring up again. There were people sitting in the British cabinet, flipping their residences from their constituencies to London and back again to avoid taxation. They ought to be in prison instead of still sitting in the House of Commons, which is where most of them are still sitting. It was the period that we've been discussing tonight, where politicians were found to be, I believe, lying, you believe merely foolish, lying, and MPs followed them into the lobbies in their hundreds. It's that which has discredited the British political system. It can be dated to the Iraq War, followed by the expenses scandal, and one institution after another of ours, banks, police, the media, parliament, have all been found, surely, to be absolutely wanting. And that's the reason there's no credibility in the political system, not because I'm saying so. The public already know it.
There's all sorts of people desperately trying to achieve things and failing because they're not very good at it. And that's much more important. In every profession I've ever been in, there's much more cock-up than there is conspiracy. I went from one, politics, where every journalist thought that there was this fantastic thing going on in politics where they'd all managed to stitch it up and they were carrying out this malign plan with brilliant efficiency. And then I go to journalism and I discover that all the journalists think the politicians have got this malign plan which they're carrying out with brilliant authority. And everybody thinks everybody else is really good at something nefarious. The truth is, the news desk is full of incompetence and the politics is full of incompetence, and we're all mildly doing our best. And that is a clearer description of politics than anything he uses.
George Galloway, we're all politicians are trying to do their best.
I really don't buy it. It may once have been true, but it is no longer. And the current parliament, what Shirley describes as democracy, has brought us to this pass that we are in. The current parliament, parliamentarians, political class, has led us over the precipice towards economic ruin. Our society is atomized, more divided than it was when Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. That's official. We're in wars all over the world and threatening others. People are trying to kill us, and sometimes, as in Woolwich last week, succeeding. We're in very, very deep trouble because of the political class that we have. The idea, the very words, assisted dying, assisted suicide, chill me to the bone, for a number of reasons. First, the Lord has set his canon against self-slaughter, as Shakespeare opined in Hamlet, and that's the reason why the major religions are against this idea, but I shan't dwell on that. I don't know how religious the audience is. I'm going to guess not very, so I'm going to go on to other arguments. This road that you're being invited to pave will lead to a kind of fascism which will be just about a sci-fi nightmare for the human race. I'll tell you what will happen. Old people will begin to think and be encouraged, implicitly or explicitly encouraged to think that they are, quote, past their sell-by date. Nobody could be less past their sell-by date than you, doctor. Your wisdom, your experience, your communicative ability, all the training and education that you've had. What do you mean past your sell-by date?
No one's past their sell-by date. Everyone's grandmother, grandfather has something to teach us until the last. But old people will be encouraged to think that they have become a burden on a capitalist society which can make no more profit from them and which can see only a long bill, a long invoice for their health care, for their personal care, will never again make profit from them, though made plenty in the past, no doubt, will calculate that when a man becomes 82, what do we have? Another 8 years of him costing us money? Let's try and imbue him and others with the idea that he should shuffle off this mortal coil. And then there's the unscrupulous relative. We've all known them. I'm blessed, I hope, not to have them. But who knows? As they look at the house you're under occupying, as they view the holiday home that would be nice to flog and go off on a world cruise on. Dad, isn't it about time you thought about assisted suicide, assisted dying? You can laugh, but there are many cases end up in the criminal courts of people who even kill their relatives and encourage others, collaborate with others to kill their relatives in order to inherit that which is theirs, but which one day upon their death could be theirs. The state, I've talked about capitalist society, let me talk about the state, which is crumbling, which cannot pay its bills, and within which the National Health Service is just about the biggest bill of them all. It would be a powerful argument, wouldn't it? All this bed blocking, all these chronically sick people who are never going to get better, parenthesis, unless some new medicine or some new medical practice comes along, in which case they might get an extension, but that'll only cost us even more. The idea that the state will not inherently, if not explicitly, be interested in an idea that medically cleanses the chronically sick wards, medically cleanses the granny farms and OAP homes and the rest.
How do you think it is possible to square those things, or is it an essential admission that it can't be done? You can't have equality for all and the promotion of individual interests.
Well, for example, I voted for gay marriage. There are millions of people in Britain against gay marriage. They have interests, and they're beginning to find their expression in the right wing of the Conservative Party. And maybe the Conservative Party will break up in part over these kind of issues. There's nothing wrong with that. People are entitled to be against gay marriage, and they're entitled to have politicians speak against gay marriage. I'm in favour of it, and speak in favour of it. And, by the way, as an ethnic grievance party, not a single person, neither a single voter nor a single member, has complained about my vote for gay marriage. So you see, these kind of caricatures of people are pernicious in the extreme. And that's why I get so cross about them. Every one of us is different, Sean. I hate alcohol. I hate gambling. I'm white with blue eyes who was brought up as an Irish Catholic immigrant. Now, what's my identity? When I see people rolling drunk down Sauchiehall Street, or maybe even Hay-on-Wye, you seem to be drinking a lot during the day here, I hate it. I hate to see people drinking alcohol. I cannot bear to see gambling adverts everywhere, on buses, on television and so on, introduced by Tony Blair, by the way, and Gordon Brown for that matter, the inventor of the super casino. So you see my point. I don't have the same culture as David. Culture's not about colour or where you come from. It's about your beliefs. That's what your culture is. And I have far more in common with somebody who believes like me from China than I do from Britain. I reject the idea that there is a British
culture. There are many British cultures.
You ask, Marianne, about Trump and his foreign policy. Let's review it. Trump has unilaterally withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal, signed Solomon binding by his predecessor, and the Permanent Five plus one, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and impeccably, I'm using the words of the IAEA, impeccably observed by Iran. Trump has unilaterally withdrawn from it, begun a raft of ever deep and punishing economic sanctions against Iran, and yesterday a major terrorist atrocity was carried out by Saudi-sponsored, which means American-sponsored, terrorists in Awaz in Iran, which killed 26 people now, not just soldiers, but old soldiers, paraplegic soldiers, members of the public in the crowd, and journalists covering the event. We are headed potentially to cataclysmic conflict. Again, in the Middle East, what could possibly go wrong? Iran will undoubtedly respond extremely violently against Saudi Arabia at any minute, certainly not long delayed. That will beget a response, and so the spiral towards war will twist.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.